Good morning, everyone. Let's wait for a minute so that everyone joins. So I hope everyone has written the test, the weekly test that was provided. And if there's any issue from the weekly test, any question that you're not able to understand, please highlight so that we can take that up as well. So starting with the next topic, which is regarding population. And with population, what are the related associated issues? Now, when we talk about population, it is basically the number of people living in an area. That's how we basically understand population, that there is a territory, defined territory, in which people live. So the number of those people constitutes population. Now, this population can be composed of people from various age groups. It can be your elderly, young, that is adult population, and children. This is on the basis of their age. Also, you can see that this can be a factor of sex as well. There can be male population, female population, and also the third gender that we talk about. So population in an area can be composed of various age groups and various sex groups. Then there is another idea of population density, which talks about the number of people per unit land area. And in India, we take this per unit land area as kilometer square. And we have already seen that there are various factors which define just a minute. Just a minute. So population density, or rather distribution of population, can be on the basis of various factors. These factors can be geographical, in the sense that you'll find that your hilly areas have less population and the population density is also low. Similarly, these geographical factors can be understood in terms of fertility of the land. That if you look globally, it is your fertile plains where you'll find most number of people living, and the population density is also high. The number of people living per square kilometer is also high. So generally, if we define, we see that the spread or distribution of a population is dependent on the economic activities and the harshness of climate. Whereas if there is a region where the climate is harsh, think about Tibetan Plateau. You'll find less and less number of people live there because it is hard to make the ends meet. It is hard to have any kind of economic production, economic activity. Also, it can be on the basis of socioeconomic factors. Socioeconomic factors like the availability of resources. Think about an area which is industrialized. Now, your industrialization is going to be on the basis of availability of raw material and also on the availability of proper transportation system, so that whatever is produced in that area can be sent to other areas. So the areas which are industrialized, which are urbanized, will have more density of population compared to other regions. And now increasingly you see that it is linked to your service sector as well. As already discussed, in post-industrial society, we find it is the service sector which employs a lot of people, which employs people more than people employed in industrial areas, industrial sector in India. And we find that our cities have been urbanized primarily because of the service sector. This was discussed with urbanization. Also, you can have various political factors like political instability. Political factors like to what extent the economy has been opened up, to what extent there is mobility of people, whether people are going to that place or not. So in terms of instability, you can see if there is a place, there is an area, there is a country where a regime is dictatorial or there is political instability because of various socio-political movements. You'll find more and more number of people moving out of those areas because of lack of security of life and livelihood. So these can be the basic reasons for the distribution of population that we see across the globe. Now, one thing related to population is, because the moment we said population and associated issues, the first indication is towards population growth. That population growth as a challenge. So the first idea that would have came to your mind is population growth as a challenge. So towards the end of our lecture, we'll discuss whether this population growth is a challenge or not. Meanwhile, what you have to do is, throughout the course of this lecture, you keep this in mind, whether population growth is coming up as a challenge or population growth can be actually better for societies. Now, this increase in population, because population, if you look into this, population has been increasing over the years. Now, what are the various factors which actually impact this increase in population? So one is the birth and fertility rates in that area, like how many children are born in that area, and also fertility rate. Fertility rate is related to women, and that too in the age of reproduction, which can be roughly considered till 49-50 years, wherein they can give birth to a child. So fertility rate basically is the number of children born by a woman in this reproduction age. Also, it can be birth rate, which is the number of births taking place in a country, to make it simple. Then also it is dependent on death rate as well. Think about death rates going low. Think about death rates because of improvement in healthcare, because of improvement in awareness. And we generally find that as the society modernizes, as we have more and more options with relation to science and technology, better healthcare, death rates tend to decrease. So a decrease in death rate and an increase in birth rate can contribute to increase in population. Also, it can be the people migrating to a certain area. So in this area, one, the death rate is low, the birth rate is high, and also there is migration to this area. Now, if we understand migration as we have taken up in the previous chapter, we see that the number of people migrating to a particular area, if it is more than the number of people leaving out of that area, going out of that area, will actually define whether there will be an increase in population or not. So these are various factors, basic factors, which talk about increasing population. Now, when we talk about fertility rates, what, in your opinion, can be the reasons behind high fertility rates? Because in India, we see that fertility rate is somewhere around 2.1. That is, a woman roughly gives birth to, on an average, 2 children during her reproductive cycle. So what can be the reasons for this high fertility rate? Because if we have to look into population growth as a challenge and want to address that issue, we should know what are these various factors and what are the factors that affect these factors. Because that's how we reach our answer. So as we're suggesting low levels of education and awareness, preference to a son, good. Now you're relating it with poverty, great. With respect to the health infrastructure that is available, what else? Early marriage, good. Use of contraceptive, that comes with awareness. Can government legislation play a role? What about the role of legislation by the government? Can someone come up with an example? Use of contraceptive, family planning, that also comes with education and awareness. Patriarchal mindset of the family, or you can think of it in terms of preference to a son. Yes, the examples of legislation can be one policy, one child policy in China. Can you relate this role of legislation to women? Because in the previous chapter we had seen that the role of sex selective abortion impacts this greatly. Yes, in India it is regarding 2 children. Great. So you basically understand what are these various factors which affect the fertility rate. Now, if you look at these one by one, there are various factors which affect fertility rate. So you can think in terms of child marriage. So the earlier a girl gets married, the chances are they will end up giving birth to more number of children. Now, early marriage or child marriages also come as a reason because of lack of education and awareness. Then if we talk about our social institution of joint family, because in joint families you'll find that it is within 1 or 2 years that a child is born because of the family pressure that once you got married, you need to give birth to children. And also this is part of the traditional mindset or setup of the society. Then Manoj is asking whether national growth rate gets affected. I'm not sure, Manoj, what is your question? Yes, we'll definitely come to growth rate for that matter. So our various social institutions and social norms, societal norms, also lead to increase in the number of children that are born to a woman in her reproductive age. For various religious reasons, you'll find that there can be religions when they suggest that you have to give birth to more and more number of children so that the message of the religion can be spread across the globe. So the more the number of children you'll have, the more the chances are more that they spread the message throughout the world. Also, if you talk about religion, religion can also be related to abortion, and you see that debate going on. Children considered as gifts of God is also related to religion. Then preference to a son child. Preference to a son can also be a reason which affects fertility rate. Because if you prefer a son, then the chances are if a girl child is born, even though you do not abort, even though you do not go for sex selective abortion, or say infanticide, you'll find that in traditional families, you'll find that if there is a girl born to a family, then there are 2, 3 girls in a line, which will be the elder ones in the family, and then once they get a son, they'll stop. Can you also highlight that why do we have this preference for son? Because this has been discussed in the previous chapter, so it can be a quick revision from there. Why do we find this preference to son? Yes, patriarchal norms. What else? For old age support, elderly care, great. To maintain the lineage of the family, because it is generally patrilineal in India. Poverty can be another reason, because sons are considered to be helping hands in taking care of the economic security of the family. Then it can be related to various rituals related to birth and death, great. The issue with respect to dowry, transfer of private property, great. Helping hand in agriculture work, yes, great. So you have a fair idea as to what are these various factors basis which we prefer a son in India. Now, because of this, as already highlighted, the chances are that if families will go on giving birth to children as long as they do not get a son. Then also the traditional mindset of the society that if you are not able to give birth to a child, then you are looked down upon in the society, because not just for the sake of function, because one idea is what is the functionality, what is the utility of giving birth to children. The other idea is the traditional mindset of making it a part, because family as an institution, one of the most important features that is being highlighted, that is generally highlighted, is giving birth to children, so that the name of the family can be passed on to the future generations. So yes, it is legitimizing marriage, which is considered to be the most important function, but also in Indian society particularly, we see that procreation or giving birth to children is also considered most important. Then also, if we talk in terms of the status of women, we say that because of the patriarchal mindset of the society, we find more preference attached to a son. Then also, the lower status of women translates into having no say in the matters of family planning. The lower status of women translates also into their lack of awareness and education with respect to family planning. Then we talk about high infant mortality rate. Just think about a traditional Indian family, and that too a few generations back. They tend to give birth to more number of children, as you can actually see in your families as well. Why? Because the infant mortality rate was high, and you find that the probability attached to a particular child, whether he or she will live or not, was low. Because of that reason, families used to think that the chances are that we'll lose this child, and they tend to give birth to more number of children. So this high infant mortality rate and child mortality rate can also be the reason. The lack of provisions for old age security, and families have to rely on their children for their old age security. So once a person starts getting older, they would not have an economic activity to take up. They'll physically go on becoming weaker, and they'll need support. So in absence of support from the state, in absence of support in terms of their security, financial and otherwise, we find that this is one of the other reasons which affects the fertility rate. And then it can come from legislation, various family planning programs, which rather than highlighting the awareness aspect, rather than talking about awareness, they just advertise and leave. They do not make the society aware as such. They make them aware about the program, but they would not spread the awareness which will actually change mindsets. And also legislation can also be linked to sex-selective abortion because of preference to a son. You see that people tend to abort the children. And also because of which the fertility rates will be high. Because if we think in these terms, yes, if you, once the child is born, if you kill them, then it does not add to the population growth rate, but it definitely adds to the fertility rate. Yes, so early age marriages, as already discussed, child marriages can be a reason for the same. Now, in Indian society particularly, and this is a general aspect, that how demographic transition takes place over a period of time. So while we move from traditional agrarian society, agrarian setup, towards the post-industrial society that we live in, there is this demographic transition that is taking place. Now, in pre-industrial phase, you'll see that you will not have good healthcare opportunities, so which will lead to a high birth rate because people are not aware. The spread of education is not much. This high birth rate can also be owed to health with respect to agriculture. So people tend to give birth to more children. Then with this high infant mortality rate, you find that the fertility rates are going to be high, as already discussed. So in a pre-industrial phase or in agrarian societies, you'll find the birth rates to be higher. And then also the death rates are also high, which basically balances this high birth rate. So the death rates are higher because of unavailability of healthcare, because of lack of intervention from the state, because of lack of awareness, which leads to malnutrition and ultimately to high death rates. So the life expectancy is low and the death rates are high in pre-industrial phase. Then as we move towards the industrialization phase, because here you'll see that the population growth is going to remain mild, because you have equivalent number of people who are dying as well. So it basically replaces the existing levels of population. But as we move further with technological advancement, we'll find that the death rates are going to get lower over a period of time. That the elderly will get better healthcare. The infant mortality rates are also going to decrease, which will lead to ultimately additional burden on the population. And also we find that the birth rates will remain higher. Because yes, there can be technological advancement, but changing the mindset of people, coming of the social change takes time. So the birth rates still remain higher. And also in the industrialization phase, it can also be linked to various policies with respect to industries. So there'll be more push towards industrial economy, and even in industrial economy, you need more and more helping hands. This industrialization will also lead to impoverishment of rural areas, people coming from rural background, and they'll also tend to give birth to more number of children. So this is the phase where actual population explosion takes place. But if we look into this, we find yes, even in India we have been following the same thing. But when we come to advanced industrial societies, things change. But in India, the matter is a little different. That will come to. So in advanced industrial society, the birth rates are also going to get low because over a period of time, people will understand it is not mere manual labor in which one has to get involved. You need better, higher specialization skills to get work. So having more number of children does not necessarily translate into enhanced economic security of the family. And also with the levels of awareness and education increasing, people tend to give birth to less number of children. But also the death rates are also low because of the betterment of healthcare facilities and also interventions from the state. Again, the another thing you'll find with respect to low birth rates is with respect to a decrease in significance of religion. So with decrease in significance of religion, the ideas like abortion become normal, that yes, one can go have abortion if they do not desire to have that child. So these are the various aspects of demographic transition. But if we look into the case of India, the birth rates are still higher compared to other societies. So this is basically the demographic transition, wherein you'll see moving from, say, agrarian economy, you're going towards post-industrial economy, that is mostly service sector based. But here in India, we find that the industrialization phase was not long enough, was not deep enough. But yes, the birth rates have remained high. And also, if we talk about the society, modern Indian society today, you'll find the birth rates are not as low as compared to your Western societies. So in Western societies, these low birth rates can be directly proportional to the decrease in significance of religion, the status of women getting better, they having better say with respect to family planning, they having better say in matters of family, availability of various contraceptive methods. But in India, the idea is different, and that's why we see the rate of population increase in India is still high compared to other societies. But there can be positives and negatives of both the ideas. So if you have excessive population, it becomes an issue, because how do you feed? The more the number of people you have, more the number of mouths you have to feed. Because it is not just about the idea of having more number of helping hands, then about the burden or the strain on resources. You can think about that. But then also, if the birth rates are low, over a period of time, you'll see that the population starts aging. There'll be more and more number of elder people in your population. So the population distribution will change, which also becomes an issue, and which is an issue faced by various countries. What we'll do is, we'll look into all these ideas in detail. So particularly population explosion, because this looks like that this can be an issue in India. Then also the aging population. Because in India, we see that the majority of our population is young, and that's in that context we talk about the demographic dividend. But also in a few states in India, say take example of Kerala, you'll find that the number of aged, the number of elderly are increasing. So the issue related to aging and various issues related to elderly. Then also we'll talk about sex ratio, which is not necessarily decreasing. We are yet to have the data on this. We are waiting for the data to come from NFHS 5 and then later from our census 21. But yes, we have seen years of decrease in sex ratio as well. So which is strange, which is different. Why? Because generally with the spread of modernization, with the increase in levels of industrialization of a society, we generally find that the sex ratios go on getting better because of the idea of egalitarianism, because of patriarchy taking it down, taking a dip. So less of patriarchal norms, increase in status of women actually translates into an increase in sex ratio. But this is not the case in India. So this is also that we'll talk about. Yes, so Yagna has asked about the problems with respect to one-child policy. Yes, we'll also take those in account when talking about population explosion. So this population explosion or population growth can be looked at from two perspectives. Whether it is desirable or it is a problem. So we'll talk about population explosion and population growth rate from these two perspectives. But before we move on to these topics, which we have to take up in detail, because elderly, one of the vulnerable sections, and also the problem of aging and sex ratio. These will be discussed in detail, but before that, let's look into other dimensions. And just give me 1 minute, just take a short 1 minute break. I'll just change the stylus because there is some issue with the stylus. Just a minute and I'll be back. Sorry for the interruption. So how would population impact climate change? And also climate change changes impact on population. What can be the reasons in which climate change can also become a problem with respect to our population? Can you please suggest what can be the various dimensions of it? Think about agriculture for that matter. Think about increased incidence of various disasters. Yes, the carbon footprints that we leave because of climate change will have less production from agriculture and hence more stress on already strained resources. Great. It will also lead to health issues. Great. So it will also lead to health related issues which will directly impact our death rates. Low agricultural output, yes. It can also lead to poverty in the sense that people would not have food security because of this changing nature of agriculture, because of increased insecurity with respect to agriculture. So yes, so you can think about this climate change in terms of migration of people from one place to another because of various reasons. It can be related to either agriculture, that they are not able to take up agriculture properly because of frequent droughts, floods. Then it can, this migration can also lead to overcrowding of a certain area and people moving away from the other, which also leads to increased stress on resources in a few areas. Then with respect to health, it will directly impact our life expectancy and death rates. Then agriculture in terms of resources as well. So this is how climate change can have an impact on population. And not just for the increase or decrease in population, but also the composition changes. Because of climate change, people will migrate from one area to another, and thereby changing the composition of the population as well. Then if we talk about consumerism, you understand it simply as the increased levels of consumption which are considered desirable. So relate this directly, one, to consumption, which is considered desirable as an economic factor. How is that? That more the number of, more the demand of products in the market, in the economy, more will be production, and hence starting this virtuous cycle of consumption and production. So the more there is demand, the more will be production. And now because of increased production, there'll be, say, purchasing power of people will be better, and they'll consume more and more, thereby starting a virtuous cycle of consumption and production. And also consumerism has to be understood as the push towards materialism. Considering that if a person has more and more material goods, they'll be happy. Because this is the idea with respect to consumerism. And consumerism can also be understood in current context, in present context, as the idea of consuming more and more, the idea of wasting more and more, the idea of changing fashion. For instance, you have new fashion coming up. Now, this is directly related to the problems associated with capitalism. And now we don't have to get into capitalism, but understand this as increased level of consumerism will lead to increased levels of consumption, increased push towards materialism, thinking it desirable to have more and more number of, consuming more and more. Now, this ultimately has both impacts on our society. One is with this virtuous cycle of production and consumption, the rates, the prices stay stabilized. Why? Because there will be a push towards mass production of goods. Now, with this mass production, more and more people will get employment, more and more people will have better purchasing power. Then also, if you talk about the demand and supply gap, it will be less, and hence low levels of inflation as well. So it can be understood as a positive dimension as well. But here if you see, if there is an increase in levels of consumption, if there is an increased push towards materialism, acquiring more and more material goods, which is being considered a direct factor of happiness. And also in this context, you can see, if you remember, there was a question which was asked in ethics about happiness. Because now it is more about material goods and less about these, the other aspects of happiness. Now we do not associate happiness without material. We think if a person has, say, X number of cars, has fancy cars, has a good house, they have better, say, social status in terms of their conspicuous consumption, we find that people relate happiness to that. But happiness, as we have seen over the years, is not a direct factor of consumerism. Now, with this consumerism, there comes another problem. If we have a tendency to consume more and more, this will strain our already strained economic resources. So undue strain on the already overburdened resources that we have. What happens with the problem of waste generation and disposal? Where do you dispose this waste? As already seen as an issue with respect to urbanization, that waste disposal is a considerable challenge today. But because of this increased consumption, because of this consumerism, we find that this has taken another proportion. So it can be thought of in terms of acquiring more and more goods, consuming more and more goods. So yes, this is the negative concept of consumerism, wherein there is more push towards more consumption. Now also this, if you think about this, why I'm touching on this theme is to understand with respect to poverty. Now we have already discussed about the difference between empowerment and development. Now also what you have to see is, with increased levels of consumption, with increased levels of production, we say that more and more people have better purchasing power, which if you look at is development. Because the basic standard of living of the society is increasing, so which can directly be understood as development. But think about what kind of impact will this have on the poorest of the poor. Because with increased purchasing power, don't you think the prices also tend to increase? Prices not just of consumer goods, but also with respect to your basic needs and necessities. And what happens to the purchasing power of the poorest of the poor in that case? So remember this theme of development, which has to be extended when we talk about poverty. So keep this in mind, because then we'll try to dissect, we'll try to look at various trends in relation to development and poverty as well. Now also there is this problem of unemployment that comes up, because the more the number of people we have, the more economic opportunities we need to provide. And we see that unemployment, which is already an existing problem in the Indian society, at least, you'll find that the higher the birth rate, the younger the population. The younger the population, you have more and more number of people in that working age group, working age bracket. So what happens to the rate of unemployment? Because it can be understood as with your idea of with your population increasing, you'll have more to consume. So one, it will definitely strain your resources, but with increase in demand for consumption, there'll be increase in demand for production. So with increased production, you can actually take care of this unemployment. So this is one perspective. But what we find is, it is not generally the case. It is that with increasing population growth rates, you'll find more and more number of people unemployed. And also look at this in context of your artificial intelligence as well. Artificial intelligence and automation, the levels of automation. Because now production has become something which has to be taken up on a mass level, which needs automation, and thereby it does not create the kind of jobs that we need. It does not create jobs in greater numbers. And also the problem with this is the same problem that we find with consumerism. That with consumerism, there is a push towards mass production of goods. Now with this mass production, you find that your small scale industries take a hit. Your small scale industries die. And also with mass production comes automation, at least in today's world, which does not create sufficient employment. And that is the reason you see that in the past 2-3 years across the globe, we have the levels of consumption and production have taken a hit. The reason being people not having purchasing power. So if you do not provide employment, how do you expect people to purchase the products that you have produced? And this is the gap between your production and consumption that we see becoming a problem today. This is something that ultimately leads to various, the rising crime rates, for instance. This can also be reflected in terms of falling position in terms of rank of India in the global hunger index. So at the same time, when we say that in terms of multidimensional poverty, we are doing better. With the recent report on National Multidimensional Poverty Index, we see that we have reduced poverty to a considerable level, which is a good sign. But at the same time, we find divergence with respect to your Global Hunger Index. That in Global Hunger Index, India's rank is going down over the years. And you'll find it surprising that at the same time, I'm saying that poverty is decreasing, but also hunger is increasing. This has to make us rethink our development strategy, developmental programs of the government, because till now we have been looking at this from the perspective of development. So previously it was growth, wherein we said that we have to increase the gross domestic product. We have to increase the levels of production in the country to make to increase the standard of living of people. Why? Because it will ultimately trickle down. But over the years we saw that it did not trickle down. But also we saw a change, a shift in the planning and the strategy, wherein it became the idea of development, wherein whatever growth rates are there in the economy have to translate into betterment of various aspects of people's life, standard of living increasing. But now we have to rethink, because yes, there has been a definite rise in terms of standard of living, betterment in terms of overall societal goals. But we find there is a certain section of our society, and it is not, you cannot say that it is not considerable. The considerable number of people who have not benefited from these developmental policies. And this is something, this is an idea, this is a perspective that you have to keep in mind while moving forward, which relates more to empowerment for that matter. Then moving ahead with poverty. Now, if you do not generate sufficient employment in the economy, how do you expect people to come out of this poverty cycle? Because you do not have many employed people. One, it directly impacts their income levels. One. Second is, it impacts their well-being. It impacts the well-being of the poor indirectly as well. Can someone think of how unemployment can impact poverty indirectly? What can be the other relationship? Apart from the low levels of income of people, which tends to make them poor, what can be the other dimension? Yes, it is economically, but what is it? Okay, education, health, yes, that is fine, that is great. Yes, the vicious cycle cannot be broken, but otherwise, just think of this. Now, to take care of our poor, we were just talking about the developmental strategy, wherein you also see that government invests in the social sector. Government invests in the poor. So if you do not employ a lot of people, where do your taxes come from? So there are two components of taxes for that matter. So your direct taxation will take a dip, and also your indirect taxes as well. So the revenues will fall down, because these people who are not employed, these people who do not have the purchasing power, would not ultimately lead to consumption, and hence growth in revenue of the governments. So if there is no growth in the revenue of the government, it will directly impact the poor, because government would not be able to take up various strategies with respect to elimination of poverty. Then moving ahead, you have to talk about the child mortality rates. Now, child mortality rates, yes, have gone down significantly over the years, but still we find that in India, they are at an alarming rate. And this is a challenge, this is a problem which has to be dealt with. Because the first thing is, the first step in it is, how do we identify child mortality as a problem? What are the various factors which impact child mortality? Can you suggest what can be the various reasons? Yes, with respect to malnutrition, the levels of nutrition of the children. What else is there? With increasing pollution, it becomes a problem. Great. Awareness and education levels of the family, and particularly the women, because it is the mother who takes care of the children generally. The lack of access to healthcare. Okay. Poor sanitation standards. Great. So basically, you can think of all the factors which impact child health, and also with increasing population, with increasing stress on resources, you find it hard to get clean drinking water. Then your malnutrition can also be linked directly with poverty and the problems with respect to your slum areas. Poor sanitation, gender disparity, okay, great. So your child mortality rates are a direct factor of these. So child mortality can be looked at from these dimensions. That because of these issues, we are not able to decrease the rates of child mortality at a faster rate. And also, if you see the recent numbers with respect to our multidimensional poverty index, you'll find a few of them being mentioned there. Your clean drinking water, the levels of sanitation, levels of education, the kind of housing facilities you have, all these factors are there in your multidimensional poverty index, which will be discussed. You need not worry about it. It will be discussed in the chapter on poverty, and you find more or less these factors there. And we see the multidimensional poverty is going down, but we are yet to see what happens to the child mortality rates. For that, we have to wait for the next phase of data to come from NFHS 5. So you also keep a keen eye on the NFHS data, which is yet to come, and also on the census data, if at all we start the process of census, of the counting process now. So the impact of decrease in multidimensional poverty index on children, and particularly child mortality rate, this is something which has to be looked into, because the rate at which we see that poverty is decreasing, and that to multidimensional poverty, which includes more or less these factors, but we do not see child mortality rates decreasing at that level. So we have to see where is the gap, but that gap can be filled only with data. So we have to wait and watch for that matter. Okay, now what we will do is, I hope you were able to understand and relate to these themes. The idea about these themes is that you can expect a direct question on these themes. Yes, they might not throw in technical jargons, but they'll definitely end up asking this question. So for instance, population and climate change, and with respect to climate change, you haven't seen a question in paper 1 yet, and this is something that you can expect. So climate change and women, because climate change is again a change which is actually bringing about far-reaching changes in our society. So climate change has to be looked at from that dimension, which can become a part of your paper 1 questions. So poverty and climate change, population and climate change, women and climate change. And then you can also see the impact of climate change on various other factors like your economic setup. So please do remember that climate change becomes important, and also for this year at least, you'll find poverty to be important, and that too multidimensional poverty, and also the gaps that are there. So that we'll discuss when we come to poverty. But climate change is a theme which should not be overlooked. Now, three dimensions that we have left here in the discussion, we'll take them up one by one. One is the issue with respect to aging. Another one is the issue with respect to sex ratio, and the third one is population explosion. Whether this population explosion is a desirable phenomena or it is a problem for the society. Now let's talk about aging. So first idea is aging of the population. That basically means the number of people who can be termed as elderly. And now again, there will find gaps with respect to how elderly are defined. So remember, we have to take it out from whatever data we have. So for example, we can think of various government schemes or programs for the elderly. So we take that definition from there. Now, the report Elderly in 2021 by MOSPI, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, they say that the number of elderly in India is 138 million, and which is bound to increase in the future. That the number of elderly in our population, as the proportion of our population, will increase in the future. And also you'll find that there is a difference with respect to male population and female population. So generally, what do we find? Generally, we find that the sex ratio is low. The sex ratio is skewed towards the male population. But in case of elderly, you find that there are considerably more number of females as compared to males. Can you suggest what can be the reason for this? Why do we find more number of females in the elderly population as compared to male? Because we see that women are the one who face violence throughout their life cycle, and they are more vulnerable to domestic and violence in public. But why do we find more female population? No, it cannot be impact of climate change. Sorry, you're mistaken there. Preference of son cannot be the reason. Yes, so life expectancy of women, as suggested by you, life expectancy in women is better. So as opposed to the traditional idea of men being considered stronger, in quotes, we find that the life expectancy in the female population is higher. Now, it can be because of various factors. Now, we do not know because it changes from society to society. But various reasons can be the level of consumption in males, consumption in terms of, say, alcohol or various other elements like that. For instance, smoking, etc. Then it can also be a direct factor of hard labor that they do. Right? So, male population is the one generally which is engaged in this labor. And it actually causes various health-related problems. Think of the men who are working in industries, highly polluting industries. And if they have to work there, they become a part of it. So it is generally the male members of the family or the men who are more vulnerable with respect to their employment. Yes, working in coal mine. And generally, we can also relate it to stress. How you can think about the responsibility of taking care of the entire family. The responsibility of family adds to stress, which can also become a reason for the same. Okay, yes, so men are the ones who become soldiers, etc. Yes. So these can be various reasons attributed to this. But one thing is clear, that the life expectancy in the female population is more. And that's why we see, when it comes to the elderly, we have more number of females as compared to males in our population. But at the same time, when we talk about sex ratio, you'll find that this sex ratio in the elderly is skewed towards females. Similarly, if we talk about the sex ratio in general population, and particularly sex ratio in children, you'll find it lower. Okay, so someone is suggesting that it is the men who get tortured by women. So no, that is not the case. But yes, you can definitely understand it in terms of stress, that is owed to the fact that they are the ones who take care of the family. They take care of all the various needs of the family. So someone is not able to understand that because of infant and child mortality rates. So the question is, we see that if there is high infant and child mortality rate, we said that the population will increase. The population will increase with infant mortality rate and child mortality rate. So the idea is, with infant mortality rate, it is ideally the increase in population, the growth rate of population should go down. But we find an increase. The reason is the life expectancy of the child. So people tend to give birth to more number of children owing to the fact that the probability of the child surviving is less. So it has more to do with life expectancy of the child. And so this is basically imbibed in the mindset of the society. Right? So with low life expectancy in children, you'll find that people tend to give birth to more number of people. So I hope your question is clear now. Then moving ahead, the report Elderly in 2021, and also you remember that the reports that come in, you should be aware and try to do one thing. Like for example, recently there was the ACER report which came out. In the month of October, you'll have your Global Hunger Index coming out. So what you have to do is, one, look at the observations from there, make notes out of it, take risk notes, because they'll be ultimately covered in your current affairs. So if you're not doing it yourself, at least write the observations from there. Then also what you have to do is look at the trends compared to previous 2-3 years. They are also covered as part of your comprehensive news analysis. But if it is not, you do it yourself and mention those things in your notes. One, to keep your notes updated, and second, to base your arguments on facts. Right? So for example, if I make the statement that there is a disparity with respect to enrollment in schools between the girl and the boys, for instance, and this is something that we deduce logically. We think that women have a lower status. Also, we give preference to a son, so they'll be the ones who will be sent to schools. And because of which, we can say that there'll be a difference. There'll be a lot of difference compared to the girl and the boy with respect to the enrollment ratio. But we find with the recent report, it is not the case. They are pretty much equal. So we have to remember that we cannot reach all the arguments logically. We have to use facts. We have to use data for that matter. So the lot of data that is there in those reports need not be remembered. You do not have to remember that how this projection has to grow. But yes, you do mention this in your notes, because luckily, if you remember it during the examination and you find a direct question on this, it makes your answers look better. Because we cannot go on making it abstract all the time. Right? So we can base our arguments in facts. So you do mention it in your notes, but do not take the stress of remembering everything, at least not before your mains examination. So luckily, if you remember it in the examination, find a question on that theme You can use those facts. So the elderly population is projected to increase by 32.7% between 2011 and 2021, while the general population has grown by 12.4%. So we see the increase in rise of the population. Now this can be directly linked to decreased death rate because of better healthcare facilities available to the elderly. Then also what we have to do is, what we have to see is that there has been a decrease in terms of birth rate. So yes, the birth rate is still higher compared to other societies, but yes, it is considerably lower as compared to the death rate. Okay, so that means in times to come, in the future, we'll have more and more elderly as the proportion of our population. Right now, if we look at our population, it is basically young. It is going to stay young for years now, because if you look at population, there can be components of young population and the elderly population. Now, over a period of time, for some time, this young population will go on increasing, but also now with young population, we are discounting the child population, because if you see that the number of children that are born in a country, tomorrow they are the ones who will get translated into working age population. So generally, we look at this working age population in terms of the ones who take care of both the segments, the leftover parts. That is, it is the working age population who will take care of the children. It is the working age population who will take care of the elderly. So this gap will go on increasing. So we'll have more and more number of elderly in our population as proportion of our population in the future. And this will cover the issue with respect to working age population will be covered. Do not worry. Now, this increase in elderly population may be due to increased economic well-being, improved healthcare facilities and medical facilities. The longevity achieved due to decreased fertility rates. How? Because the fertility rates are going down, because and we also see that it impacts the health of the women. Also, it is a life force, for that matter, that is used in giving birth. So there will be a definite decrease in mortality as the fertility rates go down. So this can be related directly to health of women. So you'll find low maternal mortality rates, for that matter, with increased healthcare. With increased healthcare, your elderly will get better facilities in terms of taking care of their diseases, and also expansion of the state in the realm of social security of the elderly. So now state is also getting into the business of taking care of the elderly. So it is now not just the joint family, it is not just the society who previously used to take care of the elderly. Now state is also stepping in. So that can also be considered as a direct factor with respect to increase in elderly population as the proportion of our overall population. Now, similarly, you can see that the rate is increasing, and at what rate it is projected to increase further. So by the year 2031, the ratio of or the proportion of elderly population as a part of our general population will increase. Now, if you look at this, these relate to the growth rates with respect to general population and elderly population. This has also been taken up from this report on elderly in 2021. So you can see how the rate of increase is that with respect to elderly population. Now let's come to the point. One is the one observation from this report is the sex ratio in elderly. That what is happening to the sex ratio? The sex ratio is skewed towards the female population, towards the women. And the other observation is the increase in growth rate. So two problems have been identified. One is sex ratio in elderly, and another one is our aging population. Yes, India is definitely enjoying demographic dividend, is going to enjoy the demographic dividend, but rather than demographic dividend, you can term it as youth bulge. Now there is a difference. Youth bulge talks about increasing number of young in our population, but unless these young people find gainful employment, unless these young people are skilled, educated, they would not translate into demographic dividend. And this is a problem, this is a theme that we are going to touch upon towards the end of our lecture. Okay, so you're not able to understand, Ajay, you're not able to understand the decrease in fertility rates. So with decrease in fertility rates, there are two dimensions. With decrease in fertility rates, you'll find that less and less number of children are born. If less number of children are born, you find as a proportion of the overall population, the number of elderly increases. That was given in the first point. Second idea is, with lesser fertility rates, with the fertility rates going down, it directly impacts women's health. If it impacts women's health, women tend to live longer if they give birth to less number of children, which is a direct factor of health of women. So there are 2 points with respect to this, and I hope your question is clear now. Now, if we talk about the sex ratio in elderly, we have already seen that it is better compared to the rest of the population, compared to the general sex ratio 1, and also sex ratio at birth. And now the sex ratio at birth is also a problem if you look at the newer data. That will also come to. Now, what will happen if the number, because it should not be a problem, it is say a better sex ratio, more number of females per 1,000 males is a better sign that the society is progressing. What can possibly be the problem with respect to this sex ratio? Now, one, this sex ratio can be understood in terms of your life expectancy in women, which is better than male members of the society. But how can it become a problem? Sex ratio is number of females per 1,000 males in our population. Increase in crime against women, great, because the elderly women will again be more vulnerable to this. Also, increase in number of widows. Now, with increase in number of widows, you think about the economic aspect. Now, just think about it. This elderly population that we have in our society today, that we have in India today, they belong to a generation where the status of women was so low that they were not even able to go out of the home and take up jobs. So what happens to their finances in that case? Because they are the ones who do not have any skill set whatsoever to take up any kind of occupation, to take care of their economic needs. And also, with respect to elderly, we find this as a problem that they cannot be, included in any kind of gainful employment at the later ages because of the decrease in productivity, because of various health issues. Yes, economic dependence on families and government. Now, Ilma has suggested that it can also lead to polyandry. But we see, Ilma, that with modernizing forces, as already discussed in the institution of family, we see the number of polygamous marriages going down. So we cannot say conclusively that it will lead to polyandry. But yes, there is a probability. And also, you remember that in that age, in the very old age, people do not tend to get remarried. Yes, it looks like a social need, and it is something which has to be promoted so that elderly can take care of themselves. Yes, it can definitely be promoted as a value, but yes, we do not find it. So yes, there can be various problems with respect to the increase in ratio, or increase in sex ratio with respect to elderly. Yes, sex ratio is increasing, but in the elderly population. And now also with respect to this, you find disparities with respect to various states. That you find that when you talk about the elderly, the distribution across various states is different. So take the case of Kerala. Now in Kerala, you find it way more compared to other states, way more compared to states like Bihar. This is the aging population graph that we are looking at. Now, if you look at this, you can simply think of lower number of or lower proportion of elderly in the population can directly be a factor of availability of healthcare. Can it be? Also, what can be other factors with respect to this? Yes, birth control measures. So with relation to fertility rates. So as we have seen that the less developed a society is, more are going to be the fertility rates. So lack of availability of healthcare, which leads to more number of deaths in terms of our elderly. Then fertility rates will be higher in Bihar, which will go on changing the proportion and keep it skewed towards the young population. What else can be there? Okay, so with respect to sex ratio, Ilma has suggested something good, and these are the kinds of observations that you have to come up with. So Ilma is saying that can be say this shift in sex ratio is a result of past efforts of the governments, when we previously had lower sex ratio and less number of female children were born. But now, Ilma, if you still look at the general sex ratio in our population, it is still low. It is in the nearabouts of 940, 945. And also, the NFHS 5 has suggested that it will take over the male population and it will reach around 1020. But it's not definite because they haven't released the entire data. So one is this sex ratio or general sex ratio, or sex ratio in general population. Another idea is sex ratio at birth. Now, yesterday, if you remember, not yesterday, but on Friday, if you remember, I given you the example from Haryana. Now, it is just one case, but we still find that the sex ratio at birth is even lower compared to your general sex ratio. Your sex ratio at birth is lower compared to your general sex ratio. So it is somewhere around 916, 920. Now, this is the problem with extending the arguments to everywhere. This is the problem with generalizing. So, this is a good observation, and you should keep coming up with these observations so that we can correct these. And hence, you become more and more careful about what you write in your answers. So, we cannot extend that argument to the sex ratio at birth. Great. Okay, so we were talking about Bihar. We are talking about why the population of Bihar is younger compared to other states. Okay, so you have talked about high fertility rates, which is a direct factor of education awareness, unavailability of contraceptive measures, the traditional outlook of society. Also, with better healthcare, we find, with the poor healthcare, we find that life expectancy in the population is lower. So yes, these are the factors which can be attributed to this. Now, in case of Kerala, you'll find it right opposite, obviously. But the problem here is with this aging population, if the proportion of aging population keeps increasing, what can be the various problems associated with it, and what can be the suggestions for the same? Because suggestions with respect to this will become very hard. Because if you suggest anything with respect to demographic changes, these demographic changes take decades to show their impact. Will take years to show their impact. If we say to make the population younger, so if we go by the simple logic, you'll find that either you have to increase the birth rates. Now, with increase in birth rates, it will actually take a lot of time to change that proportion. It will take at least a decade or two. And then other idea is increase in death rates of the elderly, which is morally, ethically wrong. So what can be the solution for this? Right. So that is the solution we have to come up with. But before that, we have to look into the problems with respect to this. Now, there are two dimensions with respect to this. So one is the dimension of dependency ratio. Now, dependency ratio is basically the proportion, the number of people who are dependent on the working age population. Now, if we increase the birth rates a lot, so who are these sections who are dependent on the working age population? Let's not get into the difference between the sexes, considering them same. Working age population. Now, you'll find two sections are dependent on them. One is children who do not earn, who cannot take care of themselves, and the other one is elderly and also disabled as well. But here, let's stick, because we have to talk about the elderly for that matter. Now, this working age population can be roughly considered to be between 15 to 59 or 60 years of age, because child labor is prohibited. Child labor is not something that we're looking up to, and also, so it cannot be lower than 15. And also, post 60, people get retired in services. So it can be considered the age bracket, because you'll find differences with respect to various metrics that are being used, but we can roughly consider it to be this. So your children and elderly are dependent directly on your working age population. Now, if you talk about elderly, if the proportion of elderly in population is increasing, there are two things happening at the same time. So the number of elderly are increasing and the working age population is decreasing. That means it'll go on increasing the gap between the working age population and the elderly population. And this elderly population, which is dependent on the working population, will become an issue because more and more number of people are now dependent on working age population. So increase in elderly population, one, and also this leads to a decrease in working age population. So both the things are happening at the same time because they're part of the same society, they're part of the same population. So more and more of elderly will depend on the working age population tomorrow. And this is what relates to your dependency ratio. Now, let's come to the problems related to dependency ratio. So let's look at your suggestions before that. Decreased participation in the workforce, yes. So there'll be less number of people who will be basically earning, who will be involved in any kind of work. Yeah, so everyone is suggesting the same argument that one has extended. So let's look at the various problems related to this. Now you'll be having, yes, okay, so you are still suggesting. So what happens to the elderly if there are increasing number of elderly? What happens to the finances of the family? What happens to the finances of the government? Because government will have enhanced burden of pension and taking care of the security of the elderly. Then it will affect the economic growth because there will be less number of people who can work and contribute to economic activities. Elderly becomes a burden. Now, Snehlata, one thing that you're saying that elderly feel like burden in nuclear family, but when you look at nuclear families, you do not have more than 2 generations, right? So you have to be a little careful with that argument. Now your suggestion has been read, and please try not to write it multiple times, because if you write it once, that is more than sufficient, right? Because it's not a question, it's a suggestion, and that too about something that we have discussed previously. Okay, so let's talk about this problem with the increasing dependency ratio, and I hope you can understand and relate. And you can also find a direct question with respect to our aging population, because aging population is going to be a problem in the future. Today and tomorrow, if you look at the demography of India, if you look at the demographic transition, we are going to stay young for quite some time. But few of our states are already facing, for example, Kerala, we are already facing this problem. So then we have to fix that problem. Now with increasing dependency ratio, one, less and less number of people contribute to the economic growth of the country. Then this is that working population on which not just the economy of the country, but various other aspects of taking care of your elderly, taking care of your children depend. Then if you look in terms of the burden of the state, which is going to increase, now states will have less in revenues, states will have less in terms of GDP, but they would have to spend more in terms of pension and social security for the elderly. Then increase in financial obligations of the family, as already highlighted by you, because primarily it is the family. Yes, there has been change with respect to the family structure in India, but it is primarily the family who takes care of their elderly, the disabled, the children. So it will be an increase in financial obligations of the family. Now there will be less number of skilled workers, because of which the demand for skilled workers will go high, because you need more and more skilled workers today. Right? The level of specialization is high, and with shrinking working age population, as you see in countries like Japan, there, if you see the population has aged so much that they do not have people to work in their industries, and they rely more and more on migration now. They need more and more people coming from outside because their own population is getting older. So with that, you'll have less number of skilled workers, which will increase the demand for them and ultimately lead to an increase in wage. Now, what happens with once the wages increase? Once the wages increase, the input cost increases in anything. If the wages increase, the services become expensive. If the wages increase, the products become expensive, which ultimately leads to inflation. And we see that how inflation can impact the poor of a country. Also, you would have to make your social structure, social infrastructure, particularly with respect to healthcare, better, and an increased spending on healthcare has to take place. And we see the number, the amount of expenditure as a proportion of our GDP, as a proportion of the GDP, complete GDP. We see that it is low, and healthcare is becoming a challenge in the sense that our poor need healthcare facilities, public healthcare facilities. Then with climate change and pollution on the increase, we need this. With number of and type of diseases increasing, we need better healthcare. Now again, we need a push towards healthcare with respect to our elderly. And do you think, this is a question for you, do you think we accord that kind of importance to healthcare in terms of public planning? Yes, so inflation in rise of the price of tomato cannot be linked here, because it is for various supply and demand reasons. It is not because we do not have skilled workers in our factories, right? So because we do not grow tomatoes in the factories. So tomatoes are coming primarily from agriculture, so and it is again a factor of demand and supply. So Nikhat is suggesting that with increase in wages, poor will get benefited, because it is better for them. But you see that when we talk about these skilled laborers who have certain set of skills, think in terms of service sector, think in terms of post-industrial society. Now we do not have a lot of work, we do not have a lot of jobs where you need unskilled laborers. So the poor actually get affected on the worst side. And also this can be understood in terms of the dichotomy between development and empowerment. So this is a good question, you remember this, that we are going to discuss these dimensions when we cover poverty, because we can make this argument that development also leads to poverty. So poverty can be understood as an outcome of development, because generally, in general understanding, we think that if development is happening, it is actually benefiting the poor, but it is not necessarily the case. Sakib, if you're not able to relate it with current affairs, the thing is maybe there's a lack of conceptual clarity in terms of this subject. So what you can do is you can try to go through your NCRTs first, NCRTs that I've suggested for class 12. Then take up the classes. The classes are already going on. Try to understand more and more in classes. Focus on conceptual clarity, and you'll be able to relate with current affairs. And you see that with time, like everyone else, you will also become a part of the process. Okay, so with this, we see that this dependency ratio will impact various dimensions in our society. It will impact our economy. It will impact our social structure. Then also, you see the impact on the economy will be in terms of lower growth and also increased expenditure on various social services like healthcare, like pension. So the overall growth rate will go down, but we'll need to spend more and more on various social sector services. So this is the idea about what happens if the dependency ratio goes on increasing. Now also, along with this, we have to understand the issues related to elderly, because one aspect is aging of population. One aspect is aging of population, wherein we say that the proportion of elderly in our population is increasing. Also, you'll find that with the number of elderly in our population increasing, we have to look into what are the issues that the elderly generally face and what can be the possible solutions for the same. So Manoj has highlighted that we are saying that elderly can become a burden on the economy, but these are the people who have worked for their life for the same economy. Yes, it is correct, and this is the right observation. But you see, in terms of burden, we are talking about burden on economic resources. With the changing family structure, changing family structure, we find that the responsibility for the elderly traditionally was taken care of by the family, and that also leads to that preference of son, because people think that it will be the son, it will be the boy child who will ultimately take care of them during their old ages. But now that dimension is changing, and also in terms of the way our our economy has industrialized and the push towards service sector, now everything is calculated in terms of economy or economical factors, and that is where we have to talk about bringing in change in the mindset, because we attach it more and more to material goods, more and more to consumerism, and that's where it has to change. So yes, writing burden on the say economy or the financial resources is not a problem, because you're not writing it, you're not saying that that's what you feel. This is something that is a general trend, because they'll be more, because the elderly are generally more dependent. Yes, we can do something about it. We can provide with a second career. We can bring back the old traditional system of joint families again back in place. We can sensitize the society with respect to the problems related to elderly, because old age homes are not the only option that we have with respect to elderly. Yes, so we definitely have to understand that they are the ones who are actually keeping the social fabric intact. They are the ones who are the flag bearers for the values in our Indian system. So okay, let's get to the problems related with aging, the problems related to elderly. Now with aging, one thing is the physical and mental health will go on going down because of natural biological factors. Then for that, if you see, they will not find adequate support, because not everyone can afford the healthcare facilities that are available. Also, think about various diseases apart from the ones that are there. So yes, there'll be a problem with respect to say mental health, dementia, etc., because they'll have a tendency to forget. There'll be forgetfulness as you age. Then also heart-related problems. But along with it, you can talk about the global nature of diseases, how there are new diseases that are coming up because of lifestyle changes, etc. Then also you can talk about the elderly who are left behind in rural areas, because generally we see that there has been nuclearization in families. Elderly are generally left behind in the rural areas. In the rural areas, would not have adequate health facilities. Also, they do not have any means to take care of their economic and social security, because they do not have, not everyone is coming from public services who will have a pension. Not everyone is lucky to have good children who take care of them. The pension that we get from the government, the pension that elderly get from the government is not substantial, is not considerable, so as to take care of their all their needs. It is say 2,000 in states. Now in 2,000 rupees today, for instance, what can you expect them to get? They cannot even take care of their basic nutritional requirement. And also with respect to the going down of values, because this has to do with our value system as well. Our values are changing. Our values are modern values are the traditional values are giving way to modern values, wherein we do not take care of the elderly today. We do not respect the elderly as we used to previously. People are not sensitive towards their needs, both emotional and psychological. The elderly are generally left alone. You find them, in places you find them hanging out together in parks, going out for walks, but it is very limited. A lot of them have to rely on the old age homes. So the old Indian tradition of joint family, and if you remember, we had talked about this with relations to positives of joint family, that a joint family takes care of their elderly. But now with the joint family system breaking down, you find a lot of new issues arising. So this is what we are talking about. So how to create this conducive and social environment wherein we take care of our elderly? How can you bring about this? How can you bring in change in the mindset of people? Can someone suggest how can we do that? So one is basically that I've already suggested, that we have to sensitize the society at large about the problems related to aging, about the problems related to elderly. What else can be done? Okay, so most of the answers you see here, yes, improvement in value system, bringing in traditional Indian values for that matter, wherein we respect our elderly. Because this problem with respect to the westernization of our ideas has also brought us to this place. Then you can talk about engaging in group activities. So one is there has to be a mixing of the elderly with the young population, because generally what we find is everyone works in silos. So elderly go on separately, the young go on separately. And because of the difference in their value systems, because the young are influenced more by modern values and the elderly have an impression of traditional values on them. So because of this difference in their value systems, people do not tend to mingle. The young and the old do not tend to mingle. So we have to enhance this so that they understand each other, so that they understand each other's perspective. Then also there can be various groups related to this, the way you have yoga groups, etc. for the elderly. Empowering them to take up second career. Yes, second career is another suggestion. Just think about this. Talk about your SHGs. Can they contribute to your self-help groups? Can they contribute to your non-governmental organizations? Can they contribute as mentors to various government departments and as mentors to your school teachers? For instance, if you have read the National Education Policy, you'll see that there is this element of mentorship by the retired faculties. So they, in that sense, can have a second career for that matter. So yes, we can support them and we can motivate them to actually transfer their experience, transfer their learnings to the younger generations. Yes, so yes, there has to be a definite push towards moral values, etc. Great. Then there can be other ideas as well. So we see that it is not necessarily because of the change of values. If you remember, when we're talking about the joint family system, we also discussed life cycle of a joint family. Now, in that life cycle of a joint family, we said that it is not necessarily a function of social values. It is not necessarily a function of social values. It can be based on, and it is generally based on economic factors. And we see that because of various economic factors, the joint families break down. Joint families get nuclearized. People tend to move away for better economic opportunities, thereby breaking down this joint family system. So what can be done? Think about this new culture in service sector of work from home. So with work from home, people get to stay with their parents at home, for instance. Now, relaxing the norms, relaxing the conditions of work. Also, when we're talking about urbanization, we're talking about developing your rural areas. Developing your rural areas, creating employment opportunities there. So if you do that, you see, people stay closer to their parents. So young stay closer to the elderly, thereby strengthening the traditional Indian value system. So yes, there can be similar points. I'm just giving you an idea to open up dimensions. So in this way, you can think about the elderly with respect to how we can make things better for them. And also, we have a few suggestions mentioned here with respect to what government programs do we have and what can be the other reasons. But before moving to that, because what we have to do is we have to remember that one, the contribution has to come from society, and another, there can be government intervention. So we have to look at both the dimensions. So with respect to government intervention, we have to see what kind of schemes, reservations, etc. the government has, and if at all there can be any suggestions for the same. And also try to relate it more to various dimensions for that matter. Because we have to see that one element of this is the breakdown in joint family structure. So if we can bring back those joint family norms, if we can make sure that people stay together, or the young stay together with the elderly, parents stay with the children, we have to see what kind of changes can be made. So yes, advancement in agriculture will also lead to the same. Yes, if elderly live with their only child family, yes, they can, because there has to be not more than 2 generations. So if a couple does not have a child, it's okay. So it's 1 generation plus 1 generation of the grandparents. So yes, it can be considered a nuclear family. Okay, great. So we have pretty much understood that what can be the various problems and how we can face those problems and come up with better suggestions. So with the decreasing health, mental health, particularly problems like depression, etc., loneliness becomes a problem. So the last point that I've made is bringing back the value system of a joint family, not just as a value system, but also as a system of family, which can help with basically betterment of the elderly. So okay, so let's do one thing. Let's take a short break, and post the break, what we'll do is we'll conclude our discussion on elderly. Just see if you can have any other points with respect to the same, and then we'll start our next theme that relates to sex ratio in population. The problem with respect to sex ratio. So 15-minute break, and we'll meet again at 8:10 and start our discussion again. So welcome back. Now what we have discussed is we have discussed the various problems related to population and the links with population and poverty, employment, unemployment, climate change, and then we started looking into the dimension of problems related with aging. So one is aging of our population, and the second one is issues related to elderly. And elderly, we have seen in aging population, we have seen the problem with dependency ratio, and then in elderly, we have seen what are the various problems related to elderly. Just a minute, we'll just fix the audio real quick. Just a minute. Is the audio fine now? Is the audio fine? Yes. Okay, perfect. And then we move on to problems related to elderly. We have looked at the problems. We have suggested a few solutions. What you can do is, whatever we have mentioned can be looked at. Apart from the suggestions that we have made, we are talking about a few interventions from the state. So with respect to maintenance of old age homes, with respect to providing various services to elderly. Then we talked about how the value system has to be changed. Then we can talk about mobile healthcare facilities. For instance, someone living in a remote area, they have a restriction on mobility. So rather than them going to another area for getting healthcare facilities, why not provide them at the place where they belong? And with respect to helpline and counseling centers, because we have seen that emotional problem or loneliness also becomes an aspect in elderly life. So why not fix those? So these can be a few suggestions. You can just go through them quickly. And also remember that we have to look at the value system as well, wherein we bring about changes in the value system. And someone had suggested that the elderly are not ready to understand the perspective on freedom, etc. They do not value the personal space that the young have. And that's where we were talking about intermingling and thereby bringing in the closing in on the gap between the value system of the elderly and the young population. So these can be a few suggestions that can be done. Now the next theme is decreasing sex ratio. Now this has been discussed to a great extent with the role of women as well. Now when I say decreasing sex ratio, you would say that the sex ratio is increasing in elderly. We have seen an increase in sex ratio in the elderly. Overall, if we talk about the general sex ratio, it has also gone up. But why do we say that there is a decreasing sex ratio? It looks infactual. It sounds infactual. When we talk about decreasing sex ratio, talk about the sex ratio at birth. This is something that is decreasing. It is not decreasing for the entire country, but at least for a few states. And this is the observation I think we had highlighted previously, that the sex ratio at birth is going down in a few states. So NFHS 5 data, and I would request everyone to go through this once because it came out recently and it is there, it is available. Just look at the trends. And also, it is to be released in 2 phases. So right now, phase 1 is out, wherein they have covered close to 17 states, I believe, and rest of the data will come out in the second phase. So till now, we see that there are many states, more than 7, 8 states, where the sex ratio at birth is decreasing. Just a minute. Just a minute, we're trying to fix the audio issue. Okay, so is the audio fine now? Is the audio fine now? Perfect. Okay, let's move ahead. And sorry for the interruption. So we were talking about the decreasing sex ratio, wherein we say that yes, the sex ratio with respect to the elderly is increasing. The general sex ratio is also increasing. But in a few states, the sex ratio at birth is decreasing. This is what it corresponds to. And also in this regard, what we have to do is we have to look at NFHS data. So I would request everyone to just go through it briefly. You don't have to remember the facts from there, just the observations, because that would do. So just mention a few facts when you find exceptions. And also you would have to wait for the second phase data to come out so that we can reach a conclusion. Now, what can be the various factors for this decrease in sex ratio? In elderly, the increase in sex ratio has already been talked about. Now, what can be the factors which are responsible for this decrease in sex ratio at birth? Now, it can be about preference to a boy, various cultural beliefs, various issues related to women, the patriarchal setup of our society, wherein we say that it is generally the male child or it is generally the male population who gets to have control over the others. And then we talk about the issue involved with dowry, related to dowry. We talk about passing on the property from one generation to another, preference to son, and various religious aspects, because there are various rituals which have to be performed only by the male child. For example, with respect to death, that they are the ones who are supposed to perform that ritual. So these can be the various factors which are responsible for decrease in sex ratio, and that too sex ratio at birth. Apart from this, economic inequalities, and if you remember, this is the entire thing that we have to understand from the perspective of role of women. And this has been discussed there, that the women are disadvantaged with respect to men, and which becomes a problem with respect to giving preference to a girl. So their low participation rates, they are not doing economically well. If they're not doing economically well, they would not have a better say with respect to access to credit. So if you want to employ women, one is to give them jobs. Another thing is to help them start a small business. Then also with respect to the property, if you look at the economic dimension with respect to property, you see that the property has to be passed on, is generally passed on towards the male lineage, wherein we find that we have the Hindu Succession Act and things have changed, but it has not materialized, which has also been discussed. Now, the idea is, what are the consequences of this unequal sex ratio? Now, if there is unequal sex ratio, think in terms of marriage. What happens to this institution? Now, people would not find a suitable partner, or the men would not find a suitable partner for marriage because there will be less number of girls, which will ultimately lead to trafficking, which will pose as a problem with respect to crime. You see the crime rate will increase for that matter. And you can think of this crime in terms of sexual violence as well. As you see that one of the biological urge is that to have sex. And if that is not fulfilled through marriage, it will be, people will tend to fulfill it through crime. Then the institution of marriage also talks about the emotional and psychological support from the partner. What happens in that case? It becomes a problem. Then the issue that someone is suggesting is with respect to capture marriage. And particularly in a few regions in Bihar, you'll find that it leads to, because it works both ways, that one not being able to find a suitable groom, they capture the groom. But also, there are increased instances of capturing the bride as well. Now, these can be various issues with relation to problems that arise out of our decreasing sex ratio. And also, you do not have to worry because this has been covered. And once you just read it, even if you just read it simply, it will do, because the entire concept is coming from the role of women. Then, if we talk about various suggestions for improving the sex ratio, one is that you have to look at the policy level changes that can be brought about, the social changes, working on the various economic factors which come directly from the problem. So, see, if we talk about economic factors, improving the status of women, or rather women empowerment, can be considered to be the way out, can be a solution, right? Now, women empowerment will lead to a better status of women, lead to a better status of women in the society, better levels of awareness, better say in the family. Also, with improved economic status and with better political empowerment, they can actually help bring the changes. And ultimately, these changes have to come in the society, because we see, if you remember the first argument we had made in the first lecture and has been repeated, that the policy level changes do not necessarily translate into social changes. So yes, there has to be effort on the policy end, but it has to be accompanied by social changes. Then various aspects, various government interventions that we can suggest, and as you're suggesting that Janani Suraksha Yojana, for instance, when we talk about curbing sex, determination of sex in womb. And with respect to this, we had talked about a problem wherein technology was playing a negative role. Technology was playing a negative role in the status of women. And this was given, the example of Haryana was given recently about the mobile ultrasound devices, which help with sex determination, and ultimately it leads to female feticide, killing of the girl child in the womb. So these can be the various dimensions that have to be covered with respect to sex ratio. But you have to remember that when we say decreasing sex ratio, you have to mention that it is with respect to a few states, and particularly with respect to sex ratio at birth. So sex ratio at birth, that too in a few states. With that, we come to the last part of our discussion here on population, which is the debate related to population growth and development. Now, population growth can work for the betterment, is good, or it can make our condition even worse. So in this regard, there are two perspectives with respect to population growth, and let's see what do you have, what suggestions do you have. So if we say population growth is good and a desirable phenomena, if we say population growth is a good and desirable phenomena, what kind of arguments do you have in the favor of this thing, in the favor of this statement? What can be the arguments? Population growth will ultimately lead to more number of people in the working age population and ultimately contribute to economic growth. What else can be there? Yes, so increase in working age population, that means decrease in dependency ratio. So economic growth will increase, dependency ratio will decrease, and ultimately we can make good use of this youth bulge that is there in our society. It will lead to more number of entrepreneurs. It will ultimately, if the economic growth, if you see, is accompanied by more number of jobs. If you have more jobs, you can target poverty. Yes. Increase in GDP, yes, it is done, increasing growth. Then also with decreasing dependency ratio, what also happens is the burden on government is reduced with decrease in dependency ratio, because now this working age population can take care of that of the population, of the elderly or the dependent population. Now with more number of young people, one is that it drives the economic growth. Another thing is there will be outward migration as well. There will be more number of people, because we see that a lot of Western countries are facing this problem of manpower crunch. They do not have enough skilled people and people in the working age bracket who can drive the economic growth. So we can be the reason, right? We can actually have migrant workers from here, skilled migrant workers from here, which will ultimately lead to remittances. That is, they learn that a person moving from India to Japan for work, why? Because there are better opportunities there. They'll ultimately send remittances. Then yes, another idea is it will strengthen our armed forces. Great observation. What else can be there? Another thing is, you see that the idea with respect to values, then we'll have more and more people who will vouch for the modern values. Then with increased economic growth, your communal harmony, which is disturbed at times because of the problems related to various economic factors, will also be under control. It can also be taken care of. And then also we can target poverty in the sense that with increased economic growth, one is more and more number of people have jobs. Then also with this, the government earns more revenue, and hence they can invest in various developmental plans and poverty alleviation schemes. So ultimately, it looks like that population growth will lead to development. It will ultimately lead to development. It will increase the standard of living of people. And yes, in terms of our people migrating outside for work, migrating outside India for work, it will also lead to better, say, in terms of global affairs with respect to international relations, be it bilateral, be it the global organizations which we have. So this will make India a stronger nation for that matter. So with increasing population growth, we can take care of the problem of aging population. We can decrease the dependency ratio. It can drive the economic growth. And also, if you see that there are arguments which say that yes, population growth is not a problem, but the actual problem is inequitable distribution of resources. The actual problem is inequitable distribution of resources. That it is that the very small section of the world or the population holds most of the resources. They have rights over most of our resources, which becomes a problem. This population growth is not a problem. Then underdevelopment of various regions is a problem. That because of this underdevelopment, we are not able to provide them enough opportunities. So if we develop the nations, they'll have more better economic opportunities, and hence they'll be able to accommodate this increasing population growth. Again, with respect to your distribution of population, think in terms of population density. So this uneven distribution of population, that more and more people are moving towards urban areas, which is creating a problem of burden on resources, It is not, it can be fixed if we distribute our population evenly, if we develop all the areas equally. And also there's a feminist argument which says that it is the subordination of women, it is the lower status of women in the society which is a problem. Population growth is not a problem. So these can be the various arguments in this regard. Then the other side of it is, and also we have to look into the theme of demographic dividend here, which is understood as your share of working population larger than the non-working population. Because what happens is, if there is a high population with respect to the the youth, which is, I told you, is youth bulge. Now this youth bulge can translate into demographic dividend. These are the young people who will actually work, who will contribute to economic growth and development of the country. This is the idea of demographic dividend. So with population growth, with higher population, we can achieve this objective of demographic dividend. So Payal has highlighted that we have various policies with respect to betterment of women. There are more and more awareness and education programs now. But still, horrible incidences like the one that happened in Manipur still happen. How can we fix this? Can we go just by education and awareness? Only spreading education and awareness is not going to be the solution. So we have to provide people with economic security, because if you remember, we had mentioned that it is the unemployed youth which ultimately becomes the agent of perpetuating this kind of violence. So if we get them into gainful employment, it can be taken care of. Also, with respect to the social factors, that the mindset of the society has to change, and it does not necessarily come with education. Because look at our education system. Don't you think it is more biased towards technical education? One thing is that we say that it is not. There is a gap between the skills that the industry require and the kind of people or the kind of resources that the education system provides. So the people who actually get education are not converted into, say, skilled laborers for these various industries. One is that which ultimately leads to less employment and this unemployed youth with the energy getting channelized in negative direction, leading to communal violence, leading to problems and incidents like the one in Manipur. Also, we have to change if we want to change the mindset, the education has to become value-based. We have to work more and more on the value system. And this is something that is coming up with each and every aspect. The value system has to be made stronger. It has to be made better. Right? So whatever elements of traditional value system are better, take them from there. For instance, tolerance. And whatever modern forces, modern values are rational, take those as well. And that's how we move in that direction. Because we cannot say that let's move back towards traditional Indian society, which we see was ridden with other kind of problems, like problems related to caste system, problems related to family. So we have to keep a mix of both. So we have to get modernized, but we don't have to leave the good traditional values that we had behind. So I hope it answers your question, that it is not just education and awareness which can help, because our education is not value-based. Yes, also setting an example of extreme punishment to the perpetrators of these kind of crimes is also a solution, because it sets an example that this is something that you have to refrain from. You cannot get away with acts like this. So it has to be a change on all the levels for that matter. Okay, so population growth being understood as not being a problem, that it is not necessarily a problem. The problem is underdevelopment, because this population growth can ultimately translate into demographic dividend. This youth bulge can convert into demographic dividend, provided we have the perfect skills in place. So if you look at this youth bulge, if you do not skill the people, if you do not provide them education, if you do not provide employment opportunities, there comes gap in utilizing this demographic dividend. So we have to understand population growth in terms of demographic dividend, but it does not necessarily come with population growth. The youth has to be skilled, has to be employed in gainful employment, and that's how we can actually achieve better economic growth. Ram Ahuja, yes, it talks about the book by Ram Ahuja on Indian society. Yes, it highlights various issues with respect to Indian society, but we see that the book is old. And with old books, what happens is there are a lot of new problems that are coming up, which are not mentioned there. And also the outlook will be old. Just think about this. The problem of poverty will be there. Now we see that with respect to poverty, the dimensions have changed. The realm of poverty is changing. Now it is not merely providing people with sufficient income and sufficient nutritional requirement. Now it is multidimensional. So the kind of suggestions, definitions, etc. you'll find there will be sort of outdated. So it's better to understand all the concepts here and keep integrating them with current affairs. So yes, the idea of Indian youth, which is educated and not employable, will also be covered with respect to education, because this is something that our national education policy has suggested, that how we can bring about changes in that. They talk about the aspect of vocational education for that matter. So yes, we'll be discussing that. Okay, so the other dimension of population growth is that population growth is a problem. Why? With increasing population, you'll find increased poverty, if you remember, from population. And I think we have not covered poverty, but let's make a vicious cycle here. What we mean by population distribution is that the population is dense, the population density is higher in a few areas which are industrialized, in urban areas, in industrialized areas, wherein they become a burden on the resources of that area. So if we distribute our population in an even manner, and how can we do that? With even economic development, so that people find employment in the region that they live, which can be a solution to this problem of overcrowded urban areas and a lot of burden on the economic and other natural resources of that region. Now if we talk about poverty, we say with poverty comes the tendency of giving birth to more number of children, increased birth rates. Why? Because these children can actually contribute to the economic well-being of the family. Then if you have high birth rate, how do you provide them with resources? You will not have enough resources to take care of them, which will ultimately lead to malnourishment, problems like related to health, malnourishment, not being able to provide education to everyone. if you're malnourished, if you do not have proper skills, if you're not educated, you cannot find employment. And if you do not find employment, how do you contribute to the economic security of the family? So this is the vicious cycle of poverty that we are going to talk about, and with respect to various factors. So do not worry about it. This vicious cycle wherein the cause becomes the effect. The cause of cause of poverty being high population, and ultimately poverty becoming an effect of high population. And I think we have discussed this question, or maybe we'll take up this question. Do not worry about it. We'll take up this question if you haven't. So this is the vicious cycle of poverty. So with increased poverty, with increased population, you'll find increased poverty. Understood from this vicious cycle. Then the role of state has to increase in terms of providing social security to people. It becomes an additional burden on the state, which translates into slower economic growth, because the governments would not have the kind of money to invest in other aspects. If you focus yourself just on social security, then you cannot take care of the economic growth. And if you focus solely on economic growth, then the poverty alleviation programs take a backseat. Then also with increased population, we see that the resources, natural resources, are fixed. And with increased population, you find the problem of food scarcity and security, because you do not have sufficient resources, you do not have sufficient food to provide to people. So extra burden on resources. So burden on financial resources of the state and burden on natural resources as well. Then how do you provide various social sector related inputs? How do you improve on the level of education of people? How do you provide everyone with such a high population? How do you provide everyone healthcare facilities? And this is something that manifested during the COVID times, that we did not have adequate health structure already. And if the population goes on increasing, how do we manage with the existing healthcare system we have? So we would have to make far-reaching changes as far as our social sector is concerned. And anyways, these two topics will be taken up separately, and there also we'll discuss the same. Then this excessive burden on the resources leads to unsustainable practices with respect to development, leads to additional burden on the resources, and with that, you find environmental degradation. Think about the number of industries that you would have to come up with. Think about the exploitation of your agricultural land that is going to happen to take care of the food security. So this population growth can become a burden on the resources, natural resources, can become a burden on the state, can lead to poverty, hunger, malnourishment, etc. So this is the other dimension of population growth. So we relate population growth to one, betterment in terms of economic growth, which can ultimately translate into development for all, which can actually make the condition of our society better. But at the same time, we see that population growth can be understood as a problem in terms of excessive burden on the resources. So these are two dimensions with respect to population growth. And again, you remember that you do not have to take a side with respect to this. What we have to do is we have to keep a balanced stand. We should know the points in both the dimensions, so that if a question is asked, we can balance it. So the answer has to be balanced. So we have looked at population growth as a challenge, and also population growth as something that can contribute to the economic growth. Now, if we say that population growth is a challenge, then there have to be suggestions what can be done with respect to what can be done. So you're saying that why women have to face violence and brutality in case of any conflict. So it has to do more with the mindset of the society, wherein they consider that women would not fight back. So the tendency or the mindset which makes us feel that the women are weak, they would not stand for their rights, they would not fight back, makes them the easiest target of violence that is perpetuated. So now if we say that population growth is a problem, there have to be suggestions. How can we fix this problem of high population rate, high population growth? So a few pointers will come directly from the previous discussion. So if we want to fix this issue of population growth, what can be the various dimensions in which we have to work? Let's work out the dimensions first. If you want to fix this problem of population growth, now population growth as a direct factor of fertility rates. And also when we talk about population growth, we talk about the problems related to population growth as well. That what are the various problems related to population growth? Because for instance, your poverty contributes directly to population growth. So please suggest the dimensions in which we have to work. What can be the various suggestions? So improving the levels of awareness and education can help, because people will be able to take up family planning, benefit out of family planning. Then we have to work on the status of women. Then intervention from the government. And can this be intervention from non-governmental organizations as well? Then also, if you want to decrease fertility rates, we have looked into various factors with respect to fertility rates, like availability of contraceptive methods, improving the status of women, increasing the levels of education awareness, targeting poverty, and ultimately bringing down the population growth. So these can be various factors which have been understood previously, which have been discussed previously. Then there can be awareness campaigns, and with respect to this, you see, you can talk about Beti Bachao Beti Padhao Abhiyan, even though it was criticized heavily on the way it was implemented previously, but we see that we have also gained out of these programs as well, and particularly in terms of multidimensional poverty index, we'll talk about various schemes and policies of the government which have brought about the far-reaching changes that we see today. The fertility rates have to be brought down to decrease population growth. To decrease population growth, the fertility rates have to come down. We have to give birth to less number of children. So yes, government intervention can be in the form of prohibiting child marriages. Great. Then there can be government intervention in terms of providing contraceptives to the poor. Because think about this. Poor are the ones who generally tend to have more growth rates in terms of population. So with government providing contraceptives, it will target population growth. It will lead to a decline in population growth if we provide awareness and contraceptives to the poor. Yes, we are close to the ideal fertility rate of 2.1 because it has to be understood in terms of replacing the population. So 2.1 is desirable in the sense that if the fertility rate is 2.1, we can perfectly replace our population. The number of elderly that die can be taken care of. Yes, so Saroni has highlighted about the honor that is attached. So with respect to honor killing, when we were discussing, we were saying that to get the honor of the family back, generally they're being killed. And also, they're used as a means to perpetuate war and violence. Why? Because the community, the owner of the entire community is related, is attached to the owner of the women. And in that case, yes, we can talk about this. This has been discussed in the previous lecture on role of women. Great. So Ilma suggested about adoption. Increase in marriage age has already been mentioned. Please be careful what is being discussed in the class. Increasing the age of marriage has already been discussed, already been mentioned. Providing free education to girl child, yes, that can ultimately lead to a better status of women who fall in that reproduction age tomorrow. So Pyle is asking whether this desire for male child or preference to son is a phenomena only of the rural India, though it is related to urban areas as well. Because if you look at this sex ratio in urban areas, it is also not that great. So that can be related to preference of son in urban areas as well. Okay, so now you understand that to decrease the growth of population, we can empower our women, we can bring in policy level changes, we can target poverty, we can talk about contraceptives, increasing the level of awareness of the society, we talk about awareness with respect to family planning, etc. So these points actually follow from our discussion previously on the status of women. Now with respect to this, the suggestions that we have seen, there are a few points that are mentioned here that you can see, and also with respect to the problem of uneven population distribution, which ultimately leads to say burden on resources in those areas, can be fixed because population growth rate in rural areas in general is high because of high fertility rates, because of lack of awareness, etc. But it is becoming a worrying trend in the urban areas as well, with the number of urban poor increasing, and that is something which we have to target, which we have to take care of. And ultimately, you see that the changes that have to be brought about have to be on a social level. We have to work on the mindset of the people. So this is something that gets repeated every time when we talk about social change. Because social change is not directly proportional to changes in policy. So social change has to be brought about from the bottom. So it is the people who have to drive any kind of social change. So these suggestions, you can look into these. These have already been discussed. Now, what we do is we move to our next dimension, that is of questions, wherein we'll see what kind of questions have been asked in the past and what can be the questions that you can expect to be asked in the future. Now, with respect to this, also as asked earlier, do you have any questions from the weekly test which you were not able to understand and articulate? If there are any questions, please suggest, because most of the questions were based on the themes directly taken from our classes, on the basis of the kind of questions that have been asked in the past. So here, if we talk about this question, if you look at this question, when we have to talk about the growth of population and its relationship with poverty. Growth of population and its relationship with poverty. Yes, media can play an important role in spreading awareness with respect to improving the sex ratio. So yes, it has to, here you have to primarily talk about the vicious cycle of poverty. Now this vicious cycle of poverty will be covered in the next chapter, and there will have a discussion again, do not worry. Let's see how do you approach this. So this question has two parts, wherein one part says that growing population can become a cause of poverty. If the population grows, it leads to poverty. Another part says that it is poverty which leads to growth in population. So this is basically divided in two parts. Now let's see what you have to say about the first part. How does population growth leads to poverty? And again, you see that we have to critically examine the statement. Anyways, they have given both the dimensions with respect to population growth and poverty in the question itself, but also we have to critically examine. So when we critically examine, one thing that we have to see is how population growth leads to poverty, and also how is it not a necessary factor. Two, how poverty leads to population growth and why it need not necessarily be the case. So think about this question first, that it has given two dimensions and we have to critically examine. So when we critically examine, we have to look at both the facets of these arguments, right? So do not miss out on this, because this forms an important part of the question. So okay, so the guy is suggesting that with the increase in population, you'll have less number of employment opportunities. With less number of employment opportunities, you'll have poverty. So unemployment can be understood as one factor. What about the fight for resources? What about the unequitable distribution of resources? Yes, scarcity of resources. Now the dependency in terms of poverty, yes, the poor is high. Overcrowding of areas, burden on resources, etc. Yeah, so okay. Let's see. Let's do one thing. Let's structure your thoughts, because you see that you are actually highlighting issues with respect to both the arguments. So what we are saying is, one dimension that we have to look into is how growing population is a cause of poverty and how it cannot be a cause of poverty. One. Second thing is how poverty is a cause of growing population and how poverty is not a cause of growing population. That's what we see when we talk about critically examining this idea. So think about population growth and poverty. Now when we say that the population increases, the number of people looking for jobs increases. If you do not increase the jobs at the same rate, people tend to stay poor. With population growth, you see that you do not have ample opportunities to skill and to educate people, which becomes a problem again. With increase in population, the government will have more and more number of people to take care of in terms of poverty alleviation schemes. Then again, if you look at the other dimension of it, that with population growth, we just talked about the idea of demographic dividend. How can you miss on this? So don't you think we can argue that with increase in population, we can convert that population into demographic dividend for the country, which will ultimately lead to growth and development of the society, and hence lead to decline in poverty. We just had discussed this argument, right? So one idea is, again I repeat, that population growth will lead to increased incidence of poverty, will become a cause of poverty. And then what we have to see is how it cannot. That with increasing population, economic growth will become much easier, because you will have more number of people contributing to the economic growth, with which the government will have more revenues to take up poverty alleviation programs. People will have more number of jobs, right? So this is one dimension. Then the other dimension is how poverty can lead to population growth. With poverty, more number of people, more helping hands. So the poor tend to have higher fertility rates. Also, let me quickly look at the suggestions that you have made so far. Yes, we'll come to a point. That's why we are taking a multidimensional approach. Deepika is saying that, yes, the question is asking about how growing population is the cause of poverty. But we have to look into both the dimensions, because we have to critically examine this statement. So if you look at this statement, it is a dual statement, which has two parts. So generally, the way of looking at it is that students tend to miss this aspect of critically examine. They think that they have to critically examine the relationship between growing population and poverty. Yes, that is one part of it. But when you say that you have to critically examine this relationship, you have to look at it from both the dimensions. So when you say that population growth leads to increase in poverty, you also have to look into how population growth can actually lead to betterment. Right? So I hope you're not getting confused with this. I'll repeat again to make it even simpler. Population growth, one idea is population growth leading to poverty, leading to increase in poverty. Another idea is population growth not leading to increase in poverty. One aspect. Then the other one is poverty leading to population growth, and also poverty not leading to population growth. And the second, now you understand, okay, you get it. So the second argument is something that will come from your idea. So poor people tend to give birth to more number of children. They have a tendency to have higher fertility rates, because the idea is that more the number of helping hands, the better in terms of economic security. So in that respect, you can understand how poverty can lead to population growth. Now let's come to the second dimension, how poverty cannot lead to population growth. Let's see what others have to say, because the guys already highlighted. Let's see what others have to say. Yes, with poverty, unawareness with respect to contraceptives, issues related to education, issues related to status of women, etc., which has already been discussed. Then poverty not being a cause of population growth. What suggestions do you have? How do you think poverty would not lead to population growth? Great. Let others say. Let's other mention the idea. Okay, great. So you are getting in the right direction. So yes, death rates will be higher in poorer households. Infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, and overall death rates will be higher. Because of which, you'll see that the population will take a dip as well. Great. Great. So now I hope you understood all the dimensions. So one dimension, population growth leading to poverty. Second one is population growth not leading to poverty. Then poverty as a factor of population growth. Then poverty not being a factor of population growth. So I hope it's clear, it's not very complicated. But the only thing is you have to realize that what the question is asked, you have to understand the demand of the question. Because generally everyone tends to talk about the vicious cycle of poverty and look at just these two dimensions. But we have to critically examine this relationship between population growth and poverty. So the question asks us to analyze how population growth leads to poverty and how poverty leads to population growth. But they have asked us to critically examine this relationship. So that's why it led us to make 4 dimensions here. And with these 4 dimensions, the easiest way to do is just have a brief introduction with respect to vicious cycle of poverty, and then you take up these dimensions one by one. In paragraph format, it would do, because you that's how much you could have you can write. So see, these tail enders that we're talking about, that give a detailed report of this. The thing is, as and when they show up in question, we take these up. So I think that process is better rather than remembering everything all at once. That discuss means this, critical examine means this, etc. It's better to take them up as and when there is a question. So on the basis of demand of the question, let's go on understanding this as a process rather than cramming that what does this mean. Because also you'll find a few of you might be from Hindi background as well, and you'll find that yes, one thing is we have to be careful about these tail enders, about these dimensions. But also you'll find that if you look at the Hindi translation of these, you'll find similarities with respect to discuss, explain. You'll find same kind of word being used. So don't you think it'll be an unfair disadvantage to the Hindi students? But the thing is that we have to understand the broader context. We do not have to exactly go by the word that they have asked, but we have to understand that what is the actual demand of the question. So if it were discussed, we would have just stuck to the 2 dimensions, but given a brief or given a glimpse of the other 2. So we would have gone with the demand of the question. What question has mentioned? We would not have taken the other perspective. And if it would have been critically analyzed, you would have followed the same process. So if you have to critically examine a statement, you always look at both the dimensions, both the sides of that particular statement. So do remember, because this is one of the problems with respect to answer writing the students face, and it generally follows from very limited understanding of various topics. Okay, so how poverty can be responsible for population growth? Poverty can be responsible for population growth because poorer households tend to have high fertility rates, tend to give birth to more children because they do not have the awareness about family planning. They think that the more the number of children, the more they'll help with economic security of the family, hence leading to population growth. And this dimension has been covered previously. This has been covered. And also what we'll do is with poverty, we'll take it up again. You just take your time, absorb this question, absorb the content that has been provided, the discussion we had, think about it during revision, and be assured that we'll take up this question with poverty as well. So if I forget for any reason, please do remind me once that we are supposed to take up this question again. And we definitely will. Perfect. Akul, I've been seeing your questions, I've been seeing your suggestions, I've been mentioning those. So even though I do not say take names at times, but I definitely address your observations and questions. And this is what I actually like the most, that the way you have been improving on the content part, the way you have been coming up with suggestions, which is a good sign that yes, you are in this learning process. So tags, with respect to tags of main questions, I've already mentioned that as and when we find these questions, we'll keep discussing, because not less than 5 to 6 tags have already been discussed with questions. So rather than giving you an exhaustive list that you have to go through and remember, it's better to understand these in the context of questions, because it makes it easier for you to understand. Yes, so in this question, you can go in a paragraph format, because in point-wise format, then you'll end up by exhausting your word limit, because you have 4 dimensions to cover. So dedicate 1 paragraph each to every dimension, and that would do. Next question: empowering women is the key to control population growth. Now, this has been discussed previously as well, and now why we keep adding this is so that you understand the important role of covering various dimensions. That there has been a fluidity with respect to questions across these topics. So, population and women, women and globalization, poverty and population, poverty and women. So, you look at these trends of the questions, that they do not tend to ask one-dimensional questions. They do not tend to ask questions limited to women. They'll talk about all the aspects, and at times you'll find that they'll ask very smart questions, difficult questions as well. But if you understand properly, you'll be able to target those questions easily. And this is something, this perspective on questions is something that actually helps you get better marks. So, for instance, in this question, if you mention the 2 dimensions, you still get, say, 6-7 marks out of 15. But if you mention 4 dimensions, the evaluator is taken by surprise. That because generally this is something that they do not expect coming from a lot of students, right? So it's better to be multidimensional. Okay, so the question says, empowering women is the key to control population growth. Now, what we have to do is, we have to discuss this. So we have to talk about 1 dimension. But what we do is, we have to give a glimpse. And I think we have discussed this question. As far as I remember, we have discussed this question. Can someone suggest? Yes, we did. And we talked about breaking it down. Right, we broke it down in introduction, body, and conclusion, wherein we also discussed that how we can maintain the continuity. So someone had suggested that we can start with data. Someone had suggested we take up another dimension, right? Yes, okay, yes. So body part will take up the positive points. Conclusion can give the ulterior perspective, and introduction can be started with other ways to control population growth, or else you can start with a data point for that matter. Great. Okay, so this question has also been discussed. Along with this, let's discuss another dimension, because if we start next chapter, we'll not be able to give you even a brief introduction of the same. Now, we have looked into the relationship between population and poverty, population and development, with respect to both the ideas about development, whether population growth is beneficial for development, and also can it be a problem with respect to development. Then we have also talked about population and women, population and elderly. How about the impact of population on children? What happens to children, or what aspects of children can be covered with respect to population growth? So in children, one way of doing it is you divide it into dimensions, that is that of sex. You can divide it in male and female, and talk about various issues related to sex ratio, and we'll come to. Then also, what happens to various dimensions, various aspects of life of children? What happens to education, healthcare? What can be other dimensions? Let's talk about other dimensions. So Satyam is saying that in tribal areas, we see that there is less population, but they are not rich. Isn't it contradictory? So he's saying that the population is low, the population growth rate is also low with respect to the tribals, but they are still not rich. Now you think about this. You think about the question yourself first. Now, one is the idea of getting rich. The one is the idea of having material possessions. If you look at tribals, think about their way of living. Think about the economic activities that they take up. Think about these 2 dimensions, and you'll get to your answer. So one, there would not be, say, high level of consumerism in those societies, in tribal societies. They would not believe in gathering a lot of material resources for that matter. So their idea of happiness is not directly linked to the idea of material possessions, one, which is inherent in their way of living, in their value system. Another thing is that the kind of economic activities that they take up are generally for the sake of what? Subsistence. They do not believe in taking a lot of surplus out of it and selling it in the market. So their idea of happiness, their way of living, their economic activities are the ones which decide their economic status. Okay, so I hope you got your answer. Okay, so we are talking about various aspects of children, how population growth will relate, will affect various dimensions. Okay, so you had started talking about this. Okay, so we are talking about various dimensions first. With respect to nutrition, okay. What else can be there? What other dimensions can be there? Mortality rates come with health, the aspect of health, rather than healthcare, sorry, it's the aspect of health. Then, with increasing population, the environment gets impacted, and that in turn impacts the children. Great. So, 2-3 dimensions with respect to children. With increasing population, you will not have sufficient educational institutions to admit our students in, or children in. Then, with respect to the healthcare facilities that will be available, it will become a challenge. Then the levels of nutrition, because ultimately population growth will lead to a scarcity of resources. Now these resources can be either related to your social security, can be related to nutrition, can be related to health, etc. Then also with this scarcity of resources, also you find overburdening of resources. With overburdening of resources, they tend to get exploited, which reflect in the problems related to environment. And also just think about this. So excessive land use extracting more and more from the same land, from this same land under agriculture, which will ultimately make the land barren over a period of time, which will lead to a lot of soil erosion, etc. Because of which, in the future, you'll have less output from the same land, productivity will be low, which in turn will affect the food security. And food security directly impacts health and nutritional status of the students, of the children. Now, with respect to health, with increasing population, with increasing fight for resources, you'll have mental health challenges, the kind of stress, anxiety that we go through. Then availability of various vaccines, etc., can become a problem. Yes, it can. Crime against children. Great point. With increasing population and ultimately increasing population density, take example of urban areas. More and more people would end up living in slums, which becomes an issue with respect to their sanitation, availability of clean drinking water, which impacts their health, education, nutritional status directly. And also, there'll be increased rates of crime. The issue with respect to children contributing to economic activities, because if you do not have sufficient resources, if the family doesn't have sufficient resources, they end up sending children for labor. Then the problem of crime covers trafficking. Crime against children covers trafficking as well. Okay, so yes, great. So Karan has highlighted that they'll have less and less area to play. So for their perfect physical and mental growth, we won't have sufficient resources. And this is something that you'll find in your ACER report 22. In ACER report, it has been highlighted that various infrastructure with respect to library, with respect to clean drinking water, with respect to computers, availability of computers, with respect to playgrounds, they're not available. So the quality of education will decrease because of overcrowding of schools, because of less teacher-pupil ratio. Great. Okay, so you're talking about the role of technology here. Yes, role of technology to improve the healthcare. Yes, it can be there. Yes, so child labor has already been taken up. Okay, so other issues related to child labor and beggary that you have highlighted. And also, if we see that with this population growth, there'll be a disproportionate effect on the female child, because they're more vulnerable to exploitation, they're more vulnerable to trafficking or entering into prostitution. Then also you'll find that more and more number of female students would not find a place in the school because of, again, reference to son. They'll end up working in the household arena. Then also the problem with respect to employment will disproportionately affect the girl child, because in the future there'll be limited number of jobs, and with which you'll find that they would not get proper opportunities for the same. Then the problem with respect to high dropout rates. Yes, so high dropout rates in boys because of child labor, and high dropout rates in girls because of contributing to household work. Yes, so with respect to technology, Ambika has highlighted, because the one who had mentioned did not complete the point. So with respect to technology, inadequate access or unequal access to various technologies. Think about technology to be used for education, for that matter. So everyone would not have proper availability of the same. So yes, you can. The idea basically was to open up the dimensions. So we have discussed the issue with respect to population growth and other dimensions, and that is the reason we took up children as well. Similarly, you can think about the impact of population growth on various institutions. What happens to the family structure? For instance, right? You just think about it. You already have the answer for this because it has been discussed. But you do think about this, and when you look at the questions, try interlinking various topics. Try interlinking population with the issue of regionalism. Try linking population with the issue of communalism. Right? So this is something that you can do. This is something that you need to remember. Okay, great. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. And what we'll do is we'll take up our next chapter, that is regionalism, communalism, and secularism tomorrow. We'll try to cover regionalism and secularism tomorrow, because secularism is a theme which is discussed in your Indian Constitution lectures, and that to discuss in detail. Here we'll talk about the social aspect of it. Then again, regionalism is primarily covered from the perspective of history, with your post-independence history. So again, but we'll definitely go through regionalism as a social challenge. So this is something that we are going to take up tomorrow. And yeah, so with respect to this, what you can do is the question that I had given, this question on population growth and poverty, please cover this question, and ultimately we'll have a discussion on this again during our lecture on poverty. Okay. So let's meet tomorrow, same time, and have a good day, everyone.